On a quiet farm in rural Cheshire, a man was chained up, beaten, burned, and tortured to death, while his son and daughter were forced to watch. It wasn't a random act of violence, it was a planned execution meant to send a message. And what happened inside that old shed on June 19, 2003, would become one of the most brutal murders in British history.
Brian Waters was more than the headlines that followed that incident. Born in the late 1950s, he grew up in Nantwich, where he would later marry his wife Julie. Friends and family remember him as loyal, devoted, and fiercely protective of his loved ones, though his life took him down darker paths as he built a small cannabis business in Holland and Cheshire.
By his early 40s, Brian's cannabis operation had outgrown a cramped backyard shed. He secured a short tenancy on Burnt House Farm, a remote property near Knutsford, Cheshire. There, alongside a partner, he cultivated plants worth thousands, recruiting his 25-year-old son Gavin and a family friend, 19-year-old Suleiman Razak, to tend the crops whenever he was away at Holland.
But success came at a deadly price. A drug deal gone wrong left Brian owing £20,000 to John Wilson, a ruthless figure in the local underworld. When Brian couldn't pay, Wilson saw an opportunity to make a public example, one that would leave no doubt about the consequences of crossing him.
To locate the hidden farm, Wilson turned to Christopher Guest Moore Jr., an undercover TV researcher with a knack for surveillance. On June 10, 2003, Moore waited outside of Brian's home on Maywarren Close in Nantwich, tailed his unsuspecting son Gavin to the farm, and mapped every track, field, and back door he could find.
Moore returned to the farm several times, observing who came and went, until Wilson pinpointed the date Brian was due to come back. Early on June 19th, Moore and a team including James Raven and Otis Matthews assembled at Moore's house on Burford Lane, Limb, loaded dried cannabis and equipment into a stolen horse box, then waited for the dirty work to begin.
At around 12 p.m., Suleiman Razak arrived to tend the crop. He was instantly ambushed, dragged into the adjoining cowshed, tied upside down, and submerged in a water barrel, convinced he would drown. When he emerged, acid was poured across his back. Staples were driven in all around his body, and he was electrocuted.
An hour later, Brian Waters pulled up in his van. He never made it to the grow room that once promised a better life. He, too, was hoisted upside down, beaten with metal bars and canes, doused in phosphoric acid, and punctured by staples. When he refused to give up the money he didn't have, the attackers forced an iron bar into his rectum, shattering bones and inflicting tortures a forensic pathologist would later describe as sadistic and gratuitous.
As Brian hung by his ankles, bruised, broken, and bleeding, he watched helplessly as his own children arrived. Gavin was punched, kicked, and had a rope pulled tight around his neck. His sister Natalie, then 21, was held at gunpoint, the cold barrel pressed against her lips. They could only stand and watch as their father's life painfully slipped away.
Julie Waters, Brian's wife, was abducted from their home in Nantwich earlier that day. Two men forced her into a car, ransacked the house, then drove her to the farm. She arrived just as Brian's limp body was being dragged across the milking parlor floor. The sight of her husband's mangled corpse would haunt her forever.
At 4:06 p.m., a frightened onlooker called the police from a nearby phone booth. Police officers arrived moments later to find the gruesome scene. 5 victims bound, beaten, and abandoned in a once quiet barn. As the attackers fled across open fields, they left behind cigarette butts, empty bottles, and a bag of feces, each having evidence of their own DNA on them.
Investigators worked tirelessly to piece together the horror. DNA from Moore was matched to the bottles at the scene. Detective Inspector Kate Tomlinson described the case as movie-like in its brutality and predicted the lifelong scars it would leave on Brian's children, who continue to battle flashbacks and trauma to this day.
In the weeks that followed, Cheshire Police Department arrested James Raven, John Wilson, and Otis Matthews. At Chester Crown Court in August 2004, Raven and Wilson were found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 24 years. Their sentences ran concurrently with 14-year terms for conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm. Otis Matthews was initially acquitted in 2004 after the jury failed to reach a verdict. but following 2 retrials, he was convicted in 2007 of murder and 2 counts of grievous bodily harm. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years before eligibility for parole.
But Christopher Guest Moore Jr. slipped away. He fled to Spain 2 days after the killing, then settled in Malta under the alias Andrew Lamb. For 16 years, he evaded arrest, living in luxury while Britain's most wanted list grew ever longer. His freedom became an open wound for Brian's family and for justice itself.
On June 6, 2019, Maltese authorities, aided by the National Crime Agency, finally closed on Moore. He was arrested in Swiki, fighting extradition by insisting the police had the wrong guy. Despite his protest, he was returned to the UK on March 29, 2020, ending an 18-year flight from accountability.
Moore's first trial in May 2021 ended in a hung jury. Undeterred, prosecutors retried the case that November. After 12 exhausted hours of deliberation, the jurors returned a guilty verdict of murder and conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm on December 9, 2021, more than 18 years after Brian Waters took his last breath.
The next day, Sir Peter Openshaw sat at Chester Crown Court to deliver the sentence. Applying the law as it stood in 2003, he imposed a life sentence with a minimum term of 24 years, accounting for the time spent in custody in Malta and the UK. On the count of grievous bodily harm to Suleiman Razak, a separate 14-year sentence ran concurrently.
In the quiet courtroom, Moore showed no emotions as the gavel fell. For Brian's children, the sentence represented both an end and a beginning, the end of a long nightmare and the start of a lifetime grappling with what they witnessed. Justice had belatedly arrived, but the echoes of that day in June 2003 will never fade.
And if you like insane crime stories like this, check out the playlist on your screen now.